The stagecoach robbery happened so fast that Catherine barely had time to scream before the masked men were gone, taking with them every piece of luggage, every trunk, and every bag that had been strapped to the top of the coach. She stood on the dusty Wyoming road in late September of 1876, watching the cloud of dirt settle as the thieves disappeared over the ridge, and realized with mounting horror that everything she owned in this world had just vanished into the vast wilderness. The other passengers climbed back into the coach, muttering about continuing to Cheyenne, but Catherine remained frozen on the road, her thin summer dress fluttering in the wind that had suddenly turned cold as the sun began its descent toward the mountains. She had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago wearing this pale blue cotton dress because it had been sweltering hot, and she had foolishly assumed that September meant warm weather everywhere. The dress had seemed practical when she boarded the train, but now, standing in the high country of Wyoming territory with evening approaching and the temperature dropping by the minute, she felt the cold seeping into her bones. Her trunk had contained her only coat, her winter clothes, and what little money she had saved from working as a seamstress. Now she had nothing but the dress on her back and the small reticule at her wrist containing $3.40. The stagecoach driver was calling for passengers to board, his voice impatient and gruff. Catherine looked down at her trembling hands and realized she was shaking, though whether from cold or shock she could not say. She climbed back into the coach and sat in silence as they continued toward Cheyenne, arriving just as full darkness fell, and the temperature plummeted even further. The other passengers dispersed quickly into the night, heading toward warm hotels and waiting families, while Catherine stood outside the station, hugging herself against the cold, trying to figure out what to do next. She had been traveling to Cheyenne to meet her intended husband, a merchant named Harold Pemberton, whom she had never actually met in person. Their courtship had been conducted entirely through letters arranged by her aunt, who knew his sister. Catherine had agreed to the arrangement because she had no other prospects and no family left after her parents died of cholera the previous year. Harold was supposed to meet her at the station, but as she looked around the dimly lit platform, she saw no one who seemed to be waiting for anyone. An hour passed, and then two. The station master eventually came out and told her they were closing for the night. When she explained her situation, he shrugged with indifference and said that Pemberton had left town 3 days ago, headed for California with a widow woman he had met at the Mercantile. The news hit Catherine like a physical blow. She stood on the empty platform, alone in a strange town, with no money, no prospects, and no coat, shivering so hard her teeth chattered. The wind picked up, howling down the main street of Cheyenne and cutting through her thin dress as though it were made of paper. She began walking, not knowing where she was going, just moving because standing still seemed impossible. The streets were mostly empty now, with only a few saloons still lit up and noisy. She passed the Grand Hotel and looked longingly at its warm glow, but knew she did not have enough money for even one night. She kept walking until she reached the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scattered houses and then to open prairie. That was where he found her, standing at the edge of civilization, swaying slightly on her feet, her lips blue with cold and her whole body shaking violently. Garrett Hayes had been riding back to his small ranch after delivering a string of horses to a buyer in town, when he saw her silhouette against the darkening sky. At first he thought she might be drunk, the way she was standing there unsteadily, but as he drew closer, he realized she was shivering so hard she could barely stand. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud, and approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her. She turned to look at him with dazed eyes, and he could see that her face was pale, her lips trembling. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy canvas jacket and draped it around her shoulders. It was still warm from his body heat, and he saw her eyes close briefly in relief as she pulled it tight around herself. "Ma'am, you are going to freeze to death out here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "What are you doing?" Catherine tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely form words. He waited patiently, watching her with concerned dark eyes, and finally she managed to stammer out a brief explanation of her situation. As she spoke, he listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and she wondered if he was going to simply walk away and leave her there. Instead, he said, "My ranch is about 5 miles from here. It is not much, but it is warm and there is food. You can stay there tonight and we will figure out what to do in the morning." Catherine knew she should probably refuse, knew that accepting help from a strange man was dangerous and improper, but she was so cold and so tired and so utterly defeated that she simply nodded. He helped her up onto his horse and then swung up behind her, wrapping one arm around her waist to keep her steady as they rode through the darkness. She was acutely aware of his presence behind her, solid and warm, and of the strength in the arm that held her securely in place. She could feel his breath against her hair and smell the scent of leather and horse, and something distinctly masculine. Under normal circumstances, she would have been mortified by such intimacy with a stranger, but tonight she was simply grateful for the warmth of his body and the steadiness of his hold. The ride seemed both endless and far too short. She drifted in and out of awareness, exhausted and overwhelmed, and barely noticed when they finally arrived at a small ranch house nestled in a valley. He dismounted first and then lifted her down, his hands strong and sure around her waist, and she realized she was still wearing his jacket. "Keep it on," he said when she tried to shrug it off. "You need it more than I do right now." He led her inside, and she had a vague impression of a simple but tidy home with rough wooden walls and a stone fireplace. He guided her to a chair near the fireplace and quickly built up the fire until it was roaring, filling the room with blessed heat. Then he disappeared into what she assumed was the kitchen and returned with a thick quilt, which he wrapped around her shoulders over the jacket. "I am going to make you something hot to drink," he said. "Just sit there and get warm." Catherine sat in the chair, staring at the flames, feeling sensation slowly return to her limbs along with a painful tingling. She could hear him moving around in the kitchen, the clink of metal and ceramic, and after a few minutes he returned with a steaming mug of coffee heavily sweetened with sugar and laced with a small amount of whiskey. "Drink this," he said, pressing the mug into her hands. Slowly. She obeyed, sipping the hot liquid carefully, feeling it spread warmth through her chest and belly. As the feeling returned to her body and the immediate crisis passed, she became aware of her host properly for the first time. He was tall, probably in his late 20s, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar and a lean, weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors. His eyes were a deep brown, almost black in the firelight, and there was a quiet competence about him that made her feel safe despite the strangeness of the situation. "I am Catherine," she said finally, her voice hoarse. "Catherine Morrison, I do not know how to thank you." "Garrett Hayes," he replied. "And you do not need to thank me. No one should be left out in the cold like that." He paused, then added, "What kind of man leaves a woman stranded at a station? The kind who finds someone better, apparently," Catherine said with a bitter laugh. "I cannot even blame him, really. We never met. I was just convenient, a solution to his need for a wife until a better solution came along." Garrett's jaw tightened. "That does not make it right." They fell into silence, and Catherine continued sipping her coffee, feeling strength slowly return to her body. Garrett disappeared again and returned with a thick slice of bread and butter and some cold beef, which he urged her to eat. She had not realized how hungry she was until she took the first bite, and then she ate ravenously, hardly caring about manners. When she finished, he said, "You need to sleep. You can take the bed. I will sleep out here by the fire." "I cannot take your bed," Catherine protested. "You have already done too much. The bed is empty either way," he said with a shrug. Might as well have someone use it. Besides, you have been through an ordeal today, you need proper rest. He spoke with such matter-of-fact kindness that Catherine found herself agreeing. He led her to a small bedroom that was spartanly furnished with a simple bed, a dresser, and a washstand. He brought her a pitcher of warm water and a clean towel, and then left her alone, closing the door behind him. Catherine washed her face and hands, relishing the feel of the warm water on her cold skin, and then climbed into the bed fully clothed, still wrapped in his jacket and the quilt. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress stuffed with what felt like straw but covered with clean linens that smelled of soap and fresh air. She expected to lie awake for hours, her mind churning over the disaster her life had become. But exhaustion overtook her almost immediately, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to sunlight streaming through a small window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment she was disoriented, not knowing where she was, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles, and looked around the simple room. Her dress was wrinkled and dusty, her hair had come loose from its pins, and she had never felt less presentable in her life. She used the remaining water in the pitcher to wash as best she could, and attempted to tame her hair into some semblance of order, but without a brush or proper pins, it was a losing battle. Finally, she gave up and simply braided it loosely, tying it with a piece of ribbon from her reticule. She folded the quilt neatly, but she kept wearing his jacket as she emerged from the bedroom, drawn by the smell of food and coffee. Garrett was standing at the stove, tending a skillet full of bacon and eggs. He looked up when she entered and gave her a slight smile. "Good morning." "I hope you slept well." "Better than I had any right to expect," Catherine admitted. "Thank you again for your kindness." He waved away her thanks and gestured to the table, which was set for two. "Sit down, breakfast is almost ready." She sat, feeling awkward and uncertain, and watched as he dished up generous portions of bacon, eggs, and fried potatoes. He poured coffee for both of them and then sat down across from her, and they ate in companionable silence. The food was simple but delicious, and Catherine realized this was the best meal she had eaten since leaving St. Louis. When they finished, Garrett pushed his plate away and looked at her seriously. "We need to talk about what you are going to do," he said. "You are welcome to stay here as long as you need to, but I imagine you will want to figure out your next steps." Catherine felt her stomach tighten with anxiety. She had been trying not to think about the future, but she could not avoid it forever. "I have very little money," she said quietly. "Not enough to get back to St. Louis, and even if I could, I have nothing to go back to. I thought perhaps I could find work here in Cheyenne, but I do not know if anyone would hire a woman with no references and no place to stay." Garrett was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. "What kind of work can you do?" he asked. "I was a seamstress," Catherine said. "A good one. I can also cook and clean and manage a household. I am educated. I can read and write and do figures." "But I know that might not be enough in a place like this." "Actually, skills like that are in high demand," Garrett said. "Cheyenne is growing fast. There are a lot of men who need clothing mended or made and not enough people who can do it well. The problem is setting yourself up with the supplies and a place to work." He fell silent again, and Catherine could see he was thinking hard about something. Finally, he said, "I have a proposition for you. Hear me out before you answer." Catherine nodded, her heart beating faster. "This ranch is small, but it is mine free and clear," Garrett said. "I run horses, breeding and training them mostly, and I do well enough to get by. But it is a lot of work for one man, and I will admit the place has gotten a bit run down. I do not have time to cook proper meals or keep the house clean or mend my clothes. I have been thinking for a while now that I need help, but I cannot afford to pay hired help what they would deserve." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What if you stayed here and kept house for me? In exchange, you would have room and board, and I would help you set up a sewing business. I know a few people in town who could use your services, and I could spread the word." You could work here during the day, and as your business grows, you would have the money to eventually get your own place if you wanted. It would be a business arrangement, nothing improper. You would have your own room, your own space. I would expect nothing from you except help keeping this place running. Catherine stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. It was extraordinarily generous, but it was also highly irregular. A single woman living alone with a single man, even in a purely business arrangement, would be scandalous. She would be ruined in the eyes of polite society. But then, she thought bitterly, polite society had not been there when she was freezing on the side of the road. Polite society had not offered her a warm jacket or a safe place to sleep. Garrett Hayes, a stranger, had shown her more kindness in one evening than anyone else had in the past year. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked quietly. "You do not know me. I could be anyone." Garrett met her eyes steadily. "I know you were in trouble and you needed help," he said simply. "That is enough. And to be honest, this arrangement would help me as much as it helps you. This place needs a woman's touch, and I need someone I can trust to help me keep it running. If you work half as hard as I think you do, it will be a fair trade." Catherine thought about her options. She could go back to Cheyenne and try to find work, but with no references and no place to stay, her prospects were grim. She could try to borrow money to get back to St. Louis, but she would be returning to a city where she had no family and no home. Or she could stay here in this rough but honest place with a man who had shown her nothing but kindness. "I will do it," she said finally. "But I need you to know that I will work hard to earn my keep. I will not be a burden to you." "I do not think you could be a burden if you tried," Garrett said with a slight smile. "Welcome to the Hayes Ranch, Catherine Morrison." They shook hands across the table, and Catherine felt a strange sense of rightness settle over her. She did not know what the future held, but for the first time since leaving St. Louis, she felt like maybe, just maybe, things might work out. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Catherine threw herself into her new role with determined energy, grateful to have something to do and a purpose to fulfill. The ranch house was not large, consisting of the main room with the kitchen and fireplace, Garrett's bedroom which had become hers, a small second bedroom where Garrett now slept, and a back room that served as storage. It was simply furnished but solidly built, and Catherine could see that Garrett was a man who took pride in his work. Her first task was to give the entire house a thorough cleaning. Years of bachelor living had left their mark, with dust in every corner and grime on surfaces that probably had not been properly scrubbed in months. Catherine washed windows, scrubbed floors, beat rugs, and organized the chaotic storage room until the house gleamed. Garrett watched her work with a mixture of amusement and admiration, occasionally helping with the heavier tasks but mostly staying out of her way. As she cleaned, she learned more about him through observation. He woke before dawn every day and worked until well after dark, tending to the horses with a patience and skill that spoke of deep knowledge and genuine love for the animals. He had nearly 20 horses on the property at any given time, a mix of mares, geldings, and young stock that he was training for sale. He handled even the most spirited animals with calm confidence, never losing his temper or resorting to harsh treatment. He was also a man of few words, speaking only when he had something meaningful to say, but Catherine found that she appreciated his quiet presence. There was no idle chatter, no need to fill the silence with meaningless conversation. They fell into an easy routine, working alongside each other during the day and sharing simple meals in the evening, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the companionable quiet. Catherine found herself watching him more than she probably should, noticing the way the muscles in his forearms flexed as he worked, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the gentleness in his hands when he dealt with a nervous horse. She sternly reminded herself that this was a business arrangement, nothing more, and that she should not let herself develop feelings for a man who was simply being kind. But it was hard not to feel something when he came home one evening carrying a large bundle wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the table and said, "I went into town today and picked up some things I thought you might need." Catherine unwrapped the bundle and gasped. Inside were several yards of good quality fabric, spools of thread in various colors, needles, scissors, and other sewing supplies. It must have cost him a small fortune, and she looked up at him with tears stinging her eyes. "Garrett, you did not have to do this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is too much." "It is an investment," he said gruffly, looking uncomfortable with her emotion. "You cannot build a sewing business without supplies. Besides, I told everyone in town that I knew a skilled seamstress who was taking on work, so you are probably going to start getting customers soon. You need to be ready." Sure enough, within a few days, people began arriving at the ranch with mending and sewing requests. First came a rancher's wife who needed several shirts made for her husband and sons. Then a young woman from town who wanted a new dress for a dance. Then an older gentleman who needed a suit altered. Word spread quickly that there was a talented seamstress working out of the Hayes Ranch, and soon Catherine had more work than she could easily manage. She set up a workspace in the corner of the main room, near the window where the light was best, and spent her days sewing, mending, and creating. She loved the work, loved the feel of fabric under her fingers and the satisfaction of creating something beautiful and useful. The money she earned was modest at first, but it grew steadily, and she carefully saved every penny, determined to eventually pay Garrett back for all he had done for her. As October turned into November and the weather grew colder, Catherine found herself settling into life at the ranch with surprising ease. She had never lived in such a remote place before, but she discovered that she enjoyed the quiet and the open spaces, the way the mountains turned pink and gold at sunset, the sound of the horses calling to each other in the morning. She enjoyed cooking meals in the simple kitchen, enjoyed the satisfaction of seeing Garrett's appreciation when she made something he particularly liked. She also found herself growing more comfortable around him, their initial awkwardness giving way to an easy familiarity. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, the son of a horse trader, and had come north to Wyoming 5 years ago seeking his own land and his own future. He had bought this property for almost nothing because it was remote, and the previous owner had given up on it, and he had spent years building it up into something worth having. "It is not much yet," he said one evening as they sat by the fire, Catherine mending one of his shirts while he oiled a saddle. "But someday I want this to be one of the best horse ranches in the territory. I want to breed horses that are known for their quality and their spirit. I want to build something that lasts." "I think you will," Catherine said softly. "You have the dedication and the skill for it." He looked at her, his eyes warm in the firelight. "It helps to have someone who believes in you," he said. "Thank you for that." Their eyes met, and Catherine felt something shift between them, something indefinable but unmistakable. She looked away quickly, her heart beating faster and focused intently on her sewing. She told herself she was being foolish, reading too much into a simple moment, but she could not deny the growing warmth she felt toward this quiet, kind man who had given her a second chance at life. As winter approached in earnest, Garrett took Catherine into Cheyenne to buy supplies and proper winter clothing. He insisted on paying for a warm coat, several wool dresses, and sturdy boots, despite her protests. "You cannot work if you are cold," he said reasonably. "And you cannot build a business if you are sick. This is practical, not charity." Catherine gave in, though she privately vowed to pay him back as soon as she was able. They spent the day in town, and Garrett introduced her to several merchants and townspeople, always careful to explain that she was his housekeeper and that she took in sewing work. Catherine noticed that he never said or did anything that would damage her reputation, always treating her with perfect respect and propriety in public. But she also noticed the way his hand lingered at the small of her back when he guided her through a doorway, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her, the way he seemed to stand just a little closer than strictly necessary. She wondered if he felt it too, this growing connection between them, or if she was simply imagining it because she wanted it to be true. Winter arrived in full force in December, bringing with it heavy snows and bitter cold. Catherine was grateful for her new winter clothes, and even more grateful for the sturdy walls of the ranch house. The work of running the ranch became harder in winter, with the horses needing extra care and the constant battle to keep pathways clear and water from freezing. Catherine did what she could to help, feeding the horses when Garrett was busy hauling water, keeping the fires going. One particularly brutal night, a blizzard struck with such ferocity that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Garrett was out checking on the horses when the worst of it hit, and Catherine stood at the window, straining to see any sign of him, her heart in her throat. When he finally appeared out of the swirling snow, she nearly cried with relief. She threw open the door and helped him inside, where he stood dripping and shivering, ice crusted in his hair and beard. Without thinking, Catherine began unbuttoning his coat, her fingers fumbling with the frozen fastenings. "You are freezing," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to get you warm." She helped him out of his coat and boots, and he stood there in his damp clothes, shaking with cold. She grabbed blankets and towels and urged him toward the fireplace, and then realized his clothes were soaked through and would need to come off. She turned her back to give him privacy while he changed into dry clothes, her face burning despite the seriousness of the situation. When he finally sat down by the fire wrapped in blankets, she made him hot coffee laced with whiskey, just as he had done for her that first night. As she handed him the mug, their fingers brushed, and she found herself kneeling beside his chair, her hand resting on his arm. "You scared me," she said softly. "I thought something had happened to you." He looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I am sorry," he said. "I should have come back sooner, but I needed to make sure the horses were secure." "The horses are important," Catherine said, "but so are you." The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning. Garrett reached out slowly and touched her cheek, his fingers cold against her skin but his touch infinitely gentle. "Catherine," he said, his voice rough. "These past few months, having you here, it has changed everything for me. You have made this house a home. You have made me realize how lonely I was before." Catherine felt her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. "I feel the same way," she whispered. "You saved my life, Garrett, not just that first night but every day since. You gave me a chance when I had nothing and no one. You treated me with kindness and respect. You made me feel valued and safe. I do not know how to tell you what that means to me." "Maybe you do not need to tell me," Garrett said, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "Maybe you just need to stay, not as my housekeeper. Not as a business arrangement, but as something more. As someone I care about, as someone I want to build a future with." Catherine felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "Are you asking me to court you, Garrett Hayes?" A smile spread across his face, transforming it from handsome to beautiful. "I suppose I am," he said. "Though we have been living in the same house for months now, so we might be doing things a bit backward." Catherine laughed, a sound of pure happiness. "I do not care if it is backward," she said. "I would be honored to be courted by you." Garrett leaned forward and kissed her, a soft, tentative kiss that still managed to send warmth flooding through her entire body. When they pulled apart, they were both smiling, and Catherine felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. From that night on, their relationship shifted into something deeper and more profound. They were still careful about propriety, mindful of appearances and the conventions of the time, but in private, they allowed themselves to grow closer. Garrett would kiss her goodnight before they retired to their separate bedrooms, soft kisses that left her dizzy and wanting more. They would hold hands as they sat by the fire in the evening, and sometimes Garrett would pull her close and simply hold her, his chin resting on the top of her head while she listened to the steady beat of his heart. As winter began to fade into early spring of 1877, Garrett and Catherine were inseparable. They worked side by side during the day and spent their evenings talking about their dreams and plans for the future. Catherine's sewing business had grown beyond her expectations, and she now had a steady stream of customers from Cheyenne and the surrounding ranches. She had managed to save a considerable amount of money, which she kept in a small box in her room, though she no longer thought of it as money to leave with. It was money for their future, whatever that might hold. One evening in March, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of purple and gold, Garrett turned to her and said, "Catherine, I need to ask you something important." Catherine felt her heart leap, wondering if this was the moment she had been both hoping for and dreading. "What is it?" she asked. Garrett took both of her hands in his expression serious but tender. "I know we have not been courting for very long by traditional standards," he said. "But I feel like I have known you forever. These past months with you have been the happiest of my life. You make me want to be a better man. You make me want to build something bigger than myself, and I cannot imagine my future without you in it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Catherine Morrison, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Catherine felt tears streaming down her face again, but she was smiling so wide her cheeks hurt. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Garrett, I will marry you. Nothing would make me happier." Garrett pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, a kiss full of promise and passion and love. When they finally pulled apart, they were both laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by the joy of the moment. "I do not have a ring yet," Garrett said apologetically. "I wanted to ask you first, and then we could go into town and pick one out together." "I do not need a ring," Catherine said, though she was touched by his thoughtfulness. "I just need you." But the next week, they rode into Cheyenne together, and Garrett insisted on buying her a simple gold band with a small diamond. It was not extravagant, but to Catherine, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. They also visited the preacher to arrange for their wedding, deciding on a simple ceremony to be held at the church in late April. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a flurry of preparation. Catherine made herself a new dress, a beautiful creation of cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. It was the finest thing she had ever made, and she poured all of her skill and love into every stitch. She also made Garrett a new shirt and vest, wanting him to look his best on their wedding day. They invited a small group of friends and acquaintances from town, people who had come to know and respect them over the past months. Catherine had made friends with several of the women who came to her for sewing work, and they were all thrilled by the news of the engagement, offering their help with preparations and decorations. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, one of those perfect spring days when the air smells of new grass and wildflowers. Catherine woke early in what would be her last morning in her own bedroom, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She bathed carefully and arranged her hair in an elegant style, weaving in small wildflowers that Garrett had picked for her the day before. When she put on her wedding dress, she barely recognized herself in the small mirror. She looked like a bride, radiant and hopeful and deeply in love. Garrett met her at the church, and the look on his face when he saw her made all the work and worry worthwhile. He looked stunned, as though he could not quite believe his good fortune, and when she reached his side, he took her hand and held it tightly, as though afraid she might disappear. The ceremony was simple but deeply meaningful. They exchanged vows in front of their small gathering of friends, promising to love and honor and cherish each other for all the days of their lives. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife and told Garrett he could kiss his bride, Garrett did so with such tenderness and joy that several of the women in attendance wiped away tears. They held a small reception at the hotel in town, with food and drink and music. Catherine found herself swept into dance after dance, first with Garrett and then with several of their guests, laughing and spinning until she was breathless. But she kept returning to Garrett's side, drawn to him like iron to a magnet, unable to bear being separated from him for long. As the afternoon faded into evening, they said goodbye to their guests and rode back to the ranch together, husband and wife. The sun was setting as they arrived, painting the sky in brilliant colors, and Garrett lifted Catherine down from the horse and held her close. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," he said softly. Catherine smiled up at him, her heart overflowing with love and happiness. "I am home," she said. "I have been home since the night you gave me your jacket and brought me here." They went inside together, and Garrett built up the fire while Catherine lit several lamps, filling the house with warm light. There was no awkwardness between them, no nervousness or uncertainty. They had lived together for months, had grown to know each other in ways that went far deeper than physical attraction. What happened between them that night was a natural extension of the love and trust they had already built, a joyful celebration of their commitment to each other. Later, lying in Garrett's arms in what was now their shared bed, Catherine thought back to that terrible night when she had stood at the edge of town, cold and alone and desperate. She thought about how close she had come to disaster, how easily her story could have ended in tragedy. But instead, she had been found by a good man, a kind man, a man who had seen her at her lowest point and offered her not pity but partnership, not charity but opportunity. "What are you thinking about?" Garrett asked, his voice drowsy and content. "I am thinking about how lucky I am," Catherine said. "How lucky we both are." Garrett kissed the top of her head and pulled her closer. "Luck had nothing to do with it," he said. "We were meant to find each other, I truly believe that." Catherine smiled in the darkness, deciding that he might be right. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was divine providence, maybe it was just dumb luck. But whatever it was, she was grateful for it every single day. The spring and summer of 1877 were the happiest months of Catherine's life. She and Garrett settled into married life with the same easy companionship they had shared before, but now with the added joy of true intimacy and partnership. They worked together to improve the ranch, making repairs and improvements that had been put off for years. Catherine used some of her saved money to buy chickens and a few pigs, starting a small but productive farm operation alongside Garrett's horse business. Her sewing business continued to flourish, and she was now known throughout the region as one of the finest seamstresses in Wyoming territory. She had enough work to keep her busy several hours a day, but she was careful not to let it consume all her time. Her priority was building a life with Garrett, and she made sure to always have time for the things that mattered most, like sharing meals together, taking evening walks, and simply sitting together and talking about their days. By late summer, Catherine began to suspect that she might be pregnant. She waited a few weeks to be sure before telling Garrett, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes. But when she was finally confident, she chose a quiet evening when they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset to share the news. "Garrett, I have something to tell you," she said, taking his hand and placing it on her still flat belly. "We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Garrett just stared at her, his expression stunned. Then a slow smile spread across his face, growing wider and wider until he was grinning like a fool. He pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and she could feel him trembling with emotion. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with wonder. "I am sure," Catherine said, laughing at his reaction. "The baby should come sometime in early March, I think." Garrett pulled back and looked at her with such love and joy that Catherine felt her own eyes filling with tears. "You have made me the happiest man in the world," he said. "Not just once, but over and over again. Every day with you is a gift." "We made this baby together," Catherine said softly. "We are building our family together, building our future together. I could not ask for anything more." The months of Catherine's pregnancy passed peacefully. She continued her sewing work as long as she felt able, though she gradually reduced her workload as her belly grew and she tired more easily. Garrett was almost comically protective, constantly worrying that she was working too hard or lifting too much or not eating enough. Catherine found his concern endearing, even when it bordered on excessive. As winter set in again, Catherine prepared for the baby's arrival with the help of several women from town who had become her friends. They held a small gathering at the ranch where they brought her gifts of tiny clothes, soft blankets, and sage advice about caring for a newborn. Catherine was touched by their kindness and generosity, and she realized that she had built a real community here, a network of friends and neighbors who cared about her and Garrett. The baby arrived on a cold night in early March of 1878, during a late winter storm that covered the land in fresh snow. Garrett rode through the storm to fetch the midwife from town, a capable woman named Mrs. Fletcher, who had delivered dozens of babies in the region. Catherine labored through the long night with Garrett holding her hand and Mrs. Fletcher offering calm encouragement. Just before dawn, as the storm was finally beginning to clear, Catherine gave birth to a healthy baby boy. He came into the world howling his displeasure at the cold air, and Catherine laughed through her tears as Mrs. Fletcher placed him in her arms. He was perfect, with a shock of dark hair like his father and surprisingly strong lungs. Garrett stared at his son with an expression of awe and terror. "He is so small," he whispered. "What if I break him?" "You will not break him," Catherine said, exhausted but happy. "Come here and hold your son." She watched as Garrett carefully took the baby in his arms, his large hands cradling the tiny body with infinite gentleness. The look of love on his face made her heart swell. They decided to name him Thomas, after Garrett's father, with the middle name James after Catherine's father. Thomas James Hayes made his presence known from the very beginning, demanding to be fed every few hours and protesting loudly when he was not held. The next few months were exhausting but wonderful. Catherine had never known it was possible to be so tired and so happy at the same time. She spent her days caring for Thomas, feeding him, changing him, rocking him to sleep, and marveling at every tiny change and development. Garrett helped as much as he could, taking Thomas in the evenings so Catherine could rest, walking the floor with him when he was fussy, changing diapers with the same patient competence he brought to everything else. As spring arrived and Thomas grew stronger, Catherine gradually returned to her sewing work, though on a much reduced scale. She discovered that she could manage small projects while Thomas napped, and several of her regular customers were understanding about the longer turnaround times. The money was less important now than it had been before. Between Garrett's horse business and Catherine's sewing, they were doing well enough to live comfortably, if not luxuriously. That summer, Garrett decided to expand the horse operation by purchasing additional land adjacent to their property. It required taking out a small loan from the bank in Cheyenne, but Garrett was confident that the investment would pay off in increased breeding stock and training capacity. Catherine supported his decision fully, trusting his judgment and his vision for their future. The expansion proved to be a wise choice. By the fall of 1878, Garrett's reputation as a skilled horse breeder and trainer had spread throughout Wyoming territory and into neighboring regions. He was getting orders for trained horses from as far away as Colorado and Montana, and he could barely keep up with the demand. He hired a young man named Charlie Robbins to help with the daily work of caring for the horses, which freed up some of his time to focus on the training and business aspects. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next couple of years. Thomas grew from a baby into a curious, energetic toddler who kept both Catherine and Garrett constantly busy. He loved the horses and would toddle after his father whenever Garrett was working in the corrals, his face lighting up with joy when Garrett would lift him up to pet one of the gentle mares. In the spring of 1880, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was met with equal joy but less surprise. They knew what to expect now, knew about the sleepless nights and the constant demands of a newborn, but they also knew about the overwhelming love and satisfaction of raising a child together. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, was born in December of 1880 during a relatively mild winter day. She was smaller and quieter than Thomas had been, with Catherine's light brown hair and Garrett's dark eyes. Thomas, now almost 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, from fetching diapers to singing her lullabies in his sweet, off-key voice. As the years passed, the Hayes Ranch continued to grow and prosper. Garrett's horse business became one of the most successful in the territory, known for producing animals of exceptional quality and temperament. Catherine's sewing business evolved into something more selective, as she focused on creating custom wedding dresses and formal wear for the growing population of Cheyenne and the surrounding area. Her work was sought after and commanded good prices, and she took pride in creating beautiful things for important occasions. They added onto the house, building additional bedrooms and a proper workroom for Catherine's sewing. The simple ranch house gradually transformed into a comfortable family home, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the warmth of genuine love. They acquired more livestock, planted a large garden, and built a barn to replace the old rickety structure that had been there when Garrett first bought the property. In 1882, their third child arrived, another son they named Daniel Matthew. He was a happy, easygoing baby who seemed to smile from the moment he was born. With 3 children now, the household was chaotic and loud and full of life. Catherine sometimes felt overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood, but she also felt deeply blessed. She thought often of that desperate girl she had been, standing alone in the cold, and marveled at how far she had come. Thomas started attending the small school that had opened in Cheyenne, riding into town with Garrett several days a week. He was bright and curious, good with numbers and letters, and the teacher said he showed great promise. Sarah was quieter and more reserved, content to stay close to home and help Catherine with simple tasks around the house. She loved to watch her mother sew and would sit for hours playing with scraps of fabric, creating elaborate stories about the imaginary people who wore the clothes Catherine made. The children adored their father, and Garrett was endlessly patient with them, teaching them about horses and the land, telling them stories about his own childhood in Texas, playing games and roughhousing in the evenings after work was done. Catherine loved watching him with their children, seeing the gentle strength he brought to fatherhood, the way he could be both firm and kind, both playful and serious. As the 1880s progressed, Cheyenne continued to grow and change. The wild frontier town of Catherine's arrival was gradually being replaced by a more settled community with schools, churches, businesses, and even some cultural amenities. The arrival of the railroad had brought prosperity and growth, though it had also brought some problems, including increased crime and social tensions. Through it all, the Hayes family remained focused on their own small corner of Wyoming, building their life together with love and determination. They faced challenges, of course. There were years when the weather was harsh and the horses were difficult to sell. There were illnesses and injuries, including a scary few days when Sarah came down with a high fever and Catherine and Garrett took turns sitting up with her all night, bathing her forehead with cool water and praying she would recover. But they faced everything together, drawing strength from their love for each other and their commitment to their family. In 1885, Garrett surprised Catherine by announcing that he had purchased the land on the other side of their southern boundary, significantly expanding their property. It was a bold move that stretched their finances, but Garrett was confident it was the right decision. With the additional grazing land, he could expand his breeding program and take on more training contracts. "We are building something here," he said to Catherine as they stood looking out over their expanded property. "Something that will last long after we are gone, something we can pass on to our children and their children." Catherine leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, and thought about how much her life had changed since that terrible night almost 9 years ago. She had arrived in Wyoming with nothing but a thin dress and $3 to her name. Now she had a prosperous ranch, a successful business, a beautiful family, and a husband who loved her more with each passing year. "We built this together," she said softly. Everything we have, everything we are, we created it together. You are the foundation of it all, Garrett said, turning to look at her. That night I found you on the road, I thought I was just helping someone in trouble. I had no idea I was meeting the woman who would change my entire life. You made me believe in something bigger than myself. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to build something that matters. Catherine felt tears prickling her eyes. Even after all these years, Garrett could still move her with his quiet declarations of love. You gave me a life when I had none, she said. You saw value in me when I felt worthless. You offered me partnership when others would have offered only charity or worse. Everything good in my life began the night you gave me your jacket. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as their children played in the distance, Thomas chasing Sarah and Daniel around the yard while they shrieked with laughter. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink and purple, and Catherine thought it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Over the next few years, the Hayes family continued to thrive. Thomas grew into a capable young man who worked alongside his father, showing the same natural talent with horses that Garrett possessed. Sarah developed into a skilled seamstress, learning her mother's trade and showing even more creativity and flair than Catherine herself had. Daniel proved to be the scholar of the family, devouring every book he could get his hands on and talking about someday going to college. In 1889, Catherine and Garrett celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary with a large party at the ranch, inviting friends and neighbors from all over the region. It was a joyous occasion, with music and dancing and abundant food. As Catherine looked around at the gathering, she was struck by how many people they knew, how many lives they had touched, how deeply they had become part of this community. That night, after all the guests had gone home and the children were asleep, Garrett and Catherine sat together on their porch, just as they had so many times before. The night was cool but not cold, and the sky was filled with stars. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if I had not found you that night?" Garrett asked quietly. Catherine considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I think about how close I came to disaster, how easily things could have gone very differently. But then I remind myself that those things did not happen. You did find me. You did help me. And everything that came after was a result of that choice you made to stop and offer kindness to a stranger. Best decision I ever made," Garrett said with a smile. "Best thing that ever happened to me," Catherine replied. "Well, except for marrying you and having our children and building this life together." Garrett laughed and pulled her close. "I love you, Catherine Hayes, more today than yesterday and less than I will tomorrow." "I love you too," Catherine said, resting her head on his shoulder. "Forever and always." As they sat together under the stars, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the scared, desperate girl she had been, shivering in a summer dress with nowhere to go and no one to turn to. She thought about the cowboy who had given her his jacket and, in doing so, had given her so much more. He had given her warmth and safety and opportunity. He had given her respect and partnership and love. He had given her a home, a family, a future. But more than that, they had built something together. Every fence post, every building, every foal born on their land was a testament to their shared work and shared dreams. Every dress Catherine made, every horse Garrett trained, every child they raised together was part of the life they had created from almost nothing. The years continued to pass, marked by both joys and sorrows as all years are. In 1891, they suffered the loss of Garrett's mother, who had traveled from Texas to meet her grandchildren and spend her final months with the family she had not seen in years. Her death was peaceful, surrounded by love, and they buried her on a hill overlooking the ranch with a simple marker that read, "Mary Hayes, beloved mother and grandmother." That same year brought happier news when Thomas announced his intention to marry a young woman named Emily Clark, the daughter of a neighboring rancher. The wedding was held at the Hayes Ranch in the summer of 1892, with Catherine making Emily's wedding dress as her gift to the young couple. It was a beautiful creation of white silk and lace, and Emily cried when she first saw it. Watching her son get married made Catherine feel old and young at the same time. It seemed impossible that the tiny baby she had held in her arms was now a man starting his own family, but it also filled her with pride and joy to see what a good man he had become. Thomas and Emily built a small house on the Hayes property and began working the land alongside Garrett, planning to eventually take over the horse business when Garrett was ready to step back. Sarah continued to develop her skills as a seamstress, and by 1893 she had taken over much of Catherine's business, allowing Catherine to focus more on the custom work she enjoyed most. Mother and daughter worked side by side in the sewing room, talking and laughing as they created beautiful things together. It reminded Catherine of the dreams she had once had of working alongside her own mother, dreams that had been cut short by illness and death. She was grateful beyond measure that she could share this with Sarah. Daniel, true to his studious nature, earned a scholarship to attend college in Denver, leaving home in the fall of 1894. It was hard for Catherine to say goodbye to her youngest child, but she was also fiercely proud of his achievement. Not many young men from rural Wyoming had the opportunity to attend college, and she wanted him to have every chance to pursue his dreams. As the century drew to a close, Garrett and Catherine found themselves entering a new phase of life. Their children were grown or nearly so, pursuing their own paths and building their own futures. The ranch was well established and profitable, requiring less of their constant attention than it had in the early years. They finally had time to simply enjoy each other's company, to take long rides through their property, to sit and read together in the evenings, to make plans for the future they would share. In 1896, Thomas and Emily welcomed their first child, a daughter they named Catherine after her grandmother. Holding her namesake in her arms, Catherine felt the circle of life completing itself in the most beautiful way. She was now a grandmother, a role she embraced with joy and enthusiasm. Baby Catherine was a sweet, placid child who rarely cried and seemed to smile at everyone, and her grandparents doted on her shamelessly. The arrival of the new generation made both Catherine and Garrett reflective about their own journey. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset with baby Catherine sleeping peacefully in her grandmother's arms, Garrett said, "We did it, you know. We built something that lasts, something worth having." "We did," Catherine agreed. "And it all started because you stopped to help someone in need. Because you chose kindness over indifference." "I got far more than I gave," Garrett said quietly. "That night I gave you a jacket, but you gave me everything. You gave me a home, a family, a reason to build something meaningful. You turned a lonely ranch into a place full of love and laughter. You made me a better man than I ever would have been without you." Catherine felt tears slipping down her cheeks, but they were happy tears. "We saved each other," she said softly. "I needed someone to believe in me, and you needed someone to build a life with. We found each other at exactly the right moment, when we were both ready to create something beautiful." As the sun dipped below the mountains, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Catherine thought about the long, winding road that had brought her to this moment. She thought about that terrified girl standing in the cold, certain that her life was over before it had truly begun. She thought about the cowboy who had seen her not as a burden but as a person worthy of help and respect. She thought about all the days and years that had followed, each one building on the last to create a life richer and fuller than she had ever imagined possible. The turn of the century brought changes to Wyoming and to the country as a whole. The wild frontier was fading into memory, replaced by towns and cities, farms and ranches, schools and churches. The Hayes Ranch had grown from a struggling one-man operation into one of the most respected horse ranches in the region, known for producing animals of exceptional quality. Catherine's reputation as a seamstress had spread far beyond Cheyenne, and she regularly received commissions from wealthy families throughout the West. But more important than any material success was the family they had built and the love they shared. Thomas and Emily had given them 2 more grandchildren by 1900, a son named Garrett and another daughter named Rose. Sarah married a schoolteacher named William Bradford in 1899, and they moved to Denver where William had accepted a position at a prestigious academy. Daniel graduated from college with honors and accepted a position with a law firm in Chicago, though he promised to visit as often as he could. Through all the changes and transitions, Catherine and Garrett remained the constant center of their family. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in 1902 with a huge celebration that brought together family and friends from across the region. As Catherine stood beside Garrett, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and completion. Later that night, lying in bed beside her husband, Catherine said, "Do you remember what you said to me that first night? You said I would freeze to death if I stayed out in the cold." "I remember," Garrett said, pulling her close. "You looked so lost and alone. I could not just ride past and leave you there." "You saved my life," Catherine said simply. "Not just physically, though you certainly did that, but you saved me in every way a person can be saved. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a chance to build something when I thought I had lost everything. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You built me a new life, Garrett, a life more wonderful than anything I could have dreamed." Garrett kissed her forehead gently. "We built it together," he said. "Every piece of it we built together. That first night I gave you my jacket because you were cold. But over the years you warmed my entire life. You brought light into dark places. You filled empty spaces with love. You turned a house into a home and a lonely man into the happiest person I know." They lay together in comfortable silence, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night. Catherine thought about the journey they had taken together, from that desperate beginning to this moment of peace and contentment. She thought about all the challenges they had faced and overcome, all the joys they had shared, all the love they had created and nurtured. As she drifted off to sleep in Garrett's arms, she sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the cowboy who had stopped on a cold September night 26 years ago, for the kindness he had shown, for the life he had helped her build. She was grateful for every moment, every memory, every day they had shared together. The early years of the new century brought more changes. Sarah and William had their first child in 1903, a boy they named Charles. Daniel met a young woman named Margaret in Chicago and married her in 1904, bringing her home to Wyoming to meet his family. Margaret was charming and intelligent, and she fit into the Hayes family as though she had always belonged there. Thomas took over more and more of the day-to-day operations of the ranch as Garrett gradually stepped back, though Garrett remained actively involved in the training and breeding program. He simply could not stay away from the horses he loved, and Catherine did not want him to. She loved seeing him in his element, working with a spirited young horse or carefully planning breeding matches to produce the best possible offspring. Catherine herself continued to so, though she was now quite selective about the projects she took on. She focused primarily on wedding dresses and special occasion garments, pieces that required the highest level of skill and artistry. She took great satisfaction in creating beautiful things, in being part of important moments in people's lives. Each dress she made carried with it her hopes for the couple, her wish that they might find the same happiness and love that she had found with Garrett. In 1905, Garrett and Catherine celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary quietly, with just their immediate family present. They had talked about having a large party, but in the end, they decided they preferred a simple gathering with the people they loved most. They shared a meal, told stories, laughed at old memories, and watched their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had played years before. That night, sitting on their porch as they had so many times before, Catherine said, I never imagined I would have a life this good. When I was standing in the cold that night, I thought my life was over. I thought I had nothing left to hope for. And look at you now, Garrett said with a smile. Grandmother to 6 beautiful grandchildren, owner of one of the most successful sewing businesses in Wyoming, wife to a man who loves you more than life itself. I am rich beyond measure, Catherine agreed. Not in money, though we have been blessed with prosperity. But rich in love, in family, in friendship, in all the things that truly matter. Garrett took her hand and brought it to his lips, kissing it gently. His hair was gray now, his face lined with age, but to Catherine he was still the handsome cowboy who had stopped to help a desperate stranger. We have built a good life, he said. A life worth living, the best life, Catherine said, all because you gave me your jacket on a cold night. I would do it again in a heartbeat, Garrett said. Every single choice, every single moment, I would do it all again to end up right here with you. As they sat together under the stars, Catherine thought about the phrase she had heard once, that home is not a place but a person. For her, that was absolutely true. Home was not the ranch house or the land or even Wyoming itself. Home was Garrett, had been Garrett from that first night when he wrapped his jacket around her shoulders and took her to safety. Wherever he was, that was where she belonged. The years continued to pass, marked by the usual mixture of joy and sorrow. They lost friends to age and illness. They celebrated weddings and births. They watched their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. Through it all, Catherine and Garrett remained devoted to each other, their love deepening with each passing year. In 1910, they celebrated Garrett's 60th birthday with a huge party that brought together 3 generations of the Hayes family. Catherine watched her husband surrounded by his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she felt her heart swell with pride and love. This man, this good, kind, generous man, was hers, had been hers for over 30 years, would be hers for whatever time they had left. That night, preparing for bed, Catherine caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. Her face was lined with age, her hair more gray than brown now. She looked like what she was, a grandmother in her mid-50s, a woman who had lived a full and busy life. But when she looked in the mirror, she also saw that girl in the summer dress, shivering and alone. She saw every moment between that night and this one, all the days and years that had transformed her from a desperate stranger into a woman with a full and happy life. Garrett came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. Together they looked at their reflection, 2 people who had aged together, loved together, built a life together. Still beautiful, Garrett said softly. Still blind, Catherine teased, but she was pleased by his words. We have gotten old, Garrett. We have gotten lucky, Garrett corrected. Not everyone gets to grow old with the person they love. Not everyone gets to build a life like this. Catherine turned in his arms to face him. I love you, she said simply. I have loved you from that first night, I think, or at least from very soon after. And I will love you until the day I die and beyond. Forever and always, Garrett said, echoing the words they had said to each other so many times over the years. That is how long I will love you. They stood together in the lamplight, holding each other close, and Catherine felt at peace. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever sorrows or joys the future held, they would face them together. They had faced everything together for more than 30 years, and they would continue to do so for however much time they had left. The final years of their lives together were quiet and peaceful. They gradually handed over more and more responsibility to Thomas and his family, content to spend their days in simpler pursuits. They took long walks around the property, visited with friends and family, read books together in the evening. Catherine continued to sew occasionally, making special items for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Garrett still worked with the horses when his health allowed, though he could no longer do the heavy physical labor required. In 1915, they celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by an enormous gathering of family and friends. 4 generations of Hayes family came together to honor the couple who had built the foundation for them all. Speeches were made, toasts were offered, and there was hardly a dry eye in the house when Garrett stood to speak. 40 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I married the woman I had found shivering on the side of the road 6 months earlier. I gave her my jacket that night because she was cold, never knowing that she would spend the rest of her life warming mine. Catherine, you have been my partner, my lover, my best friend, my everything. You took a lonely cowboy with a struggling ranch and turned his life into something magical. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to wake up every morning with joy in my heart. I cannot imagine my life without you, and I thank God every single day that I happened to be riding down that road the night you needed help. Catherine was crying openly as she stood to embrace her husband, and there was not a person in the room who was not moved by his words. After the party ended and they were alone again, Catherine said, "That was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me." "It was nothing but the truth," Garrett said, "every single word." They lived several more good years together, years filled with the quiet contentment of a life well lived. They watched their family continue to grow and prosper. They took joy in the success of their children and the promise of their grandchildren. They sat together on their porch on warm summer evenings and watched the sun set behind the mountains, neither of them needing to speak because everything important had already been said. Garrett passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1918, 2 months after his 68th birthday. Catherine woke one morning to find him lying beside her, his face peaceful, his hand still holding hers. She knew immediately that he was gone, and the grief that washed over her was almost unbearable. But underneath the grief was gratitude. Gratitude that he had not suffered, gratitude that they had been given so many years together, gratitude for every moment they had shared. They buried him on the hill next to his mother, with a view overlooking the ranch he had built and loved. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives Garrett had touched over the years. Person after person came up to Catherine to share stories about her husband's kindness, his generosity, his quiet strength. She listened to them all, finding comfort in knowing that Garrett had made a difference in so many lives. Catherine lived for 5 more years after Garrett's death, years that were bittersweet. She missed him every single day, missed his quiet presence, his gentle touch, his steady love. But she was surrounded by family, by the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren they had created together, and she found joy in watching them live their lives. She continued to sew occasionally, making special items for family members, each stitch a meditation on the life she had lived. She spent time with her grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, about the ranch in its early days, about the long-ago night when a cowboy stopped to help a stranger in need. On a warm September evening in 1923, almost exactly 47 years after that fateful night, Catherine sat on her porch watching the sunset. She was 89 years old now, her body frail but her mind still sharp. She thought about the incredible journey her life had been, from desperate poverty to prosperity, from loneliness to abundant love, from having nothing to having everything that mattered. She thought about Garrett, about the life they had built together, about the love that had sustained them through nearly 43 years of marriage. She thought about his kindness that first night, about the jacket he had draped around her shoulders, about the way he had looked at her even then with respect and concern. She thought about all the moments that had followed, thousands and thousands of moments that had woven together to create a life of meaning and purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, and the stars began to appear, Catherine felt a profound sense of peace. She had been given a gift, the gift of a second chance when she thought all was lost, the gift of love when she felt unlovable, the gift of a partner who had built her a new life brick by brick, day by day, moment by moment. She closed her eyes, still feeling the warmth of Garrett's jacket around her shoulders even though it had long since worn out and been put away. She could hear his voice saying, as he had so many times, "Forever and always." And she whispered back into the gathering darkness, "Forever and always, my love." Catherine passed away peacefully that night in her sleep, a smile on her face. They buried her beside Garrett on the hill overlooking the ranch, and their headstone bore a simple inscription: Garrett and Catherine Hayes. Together they built a life of love. The ranch continued to prosper under the care of their descendants, generation after generation working the land and raising horses, carrying on the legacy of the cowboy who had stopped to help a stranger, and the woman who had turned his lonely house into a home filled with love. Their story became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The tale of how grandfather Garrett had found grandmother Catherine shivering in a summer dress, how he had given her his jacket, how he had taken her home and given her a chance to build a new life, how they had fallen in love and created something beautiful together. It was a story about kindness and courage, about taking chances and building dreams, about love that lasts not just through the good times but through all times. And every time the story was told, usually on warm summer evenings when the family gathered together, someone would always say the same thing: that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything, that sometimes a life can turn on a single moment of generosity, that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stop and help, willing to see another person's worth, willing to offer not just a jacket but a hand up and a chance at something better. The Hayes Ranch stood for generations as a testament to what Catherine and Garrett had built together, a monument to their love and their partnership. And somewhere in the house, carefully preserved in a trunk, was an old canvas jacket, worn and faded but precious beyond measure. Because that jacket represented more than just warmth on a cold night. It represented the beginning of everything, the moment when two lives intersected and changed each other forever, the point where Catherine's story of desperation transformed into a story of hope and love and abundant life. Their great-great-grandchildren would sometimes take out that old jacket and hold it carefully, trying to imagine that long-ago night when everything began. They would think about the scared young woman and the kind cowboy, about the choice he made to stop and help, about the life they built together from that simple beginning. And they would understand in their bones what their elders had always tried to teach them. That love is not just a feeling but a series of choices, a commitment to building something together, a willingness to give someone your jacket when they are cold and then spend the rest of your life keeping them warm. The story of Catherine and Garrett Hayes lived on, passed down through the generations, a reminder that even in the hardest times kindness matters, that even when all seems lost, hope can be found. That sometimes the best things in life begin with a simple act of compassion, a willingness to see another person's need and respond with generosity and care. And so the legacy continued, generation after generation, each one carrying forward the values that Catherine and Garrett had embodied: hard work, integrity, kindness, and above all, love. The ranch that Garrett had built and Catherine had turned into a home remained in the family, a living memorial to two people who had found each other on a cold September night and chosen to build a life together, a life that proved to be more wonderful than either of them could have imagined. Their story was one of transformation and redemption, of second chances and new beginnings, of love that endures through all challenges and grows stronger with each passing year. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that our lives can change in an instant, that the kindness of a stranger can alter the course of our destiny, that sometimes the best things come from the worst circumstances. Most of all, it was a love story, pure and simple. A story about a cowboy who gave his jacket to a shivering woman and then gave her so much more: his heart, his home, his life. A story about a woman who took that offered kindness and repaid it 1,000 times over with love and partnership and devotion. A story about two people who built something beautiful together, something that lasted long after they were gone, something that continued to touch lives and inspire hearts generations later. And that, their descendants would say as they finished telling the story once more, is what true love really is. Not just flowers and pretty words, but building something together. Not just passion that burns bright and fades, but steady devotion that weathers storms and grows deeper with time. Not just taking, but giving. Not just receiving help, but offering it. Not just being saved, but saving each other every single day in countless small ways. The sun set over the Hayes Ranch one more time as it had thousands of times before, painting the sky in brilliant colors. Somewhere on the hill overlooking the land, two simple headstones stood side by side, marking the resting place of Catherine and Garrett Hayes. And if the wind blew just right, you could almost hear their voices echoing across the years. Forever and always. Forever and always. The words of a love that truly did last forever, built on a foundation of kindness, nurtured by partnership, and sustained by the simple truth that sometimes all it takes to change a life is one person willing to stop, willing to care, willing to offer their jacket to someone standing in the cold.